Hey kiddos, so today we are going to talk about World War I and the effects that it had on the United States and the world. Our focus really today is not so much like the military history, but instead focusing on American foreign policy leading up to our entry into World War I, and then obviously like the lasting effects that it had on the home front. In addition to the United States kind of on this world stage after the war and the peace treaty negotiation. And so it's an important war in that it takes place after American imperialism. So the United States, after Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and this war takes place during Wilson's administration. American imperialism, that era was starting with Teddy Roosevelt. It's kind of this turning point in American history in regards to foreign policy. So you'll notice that now that we're in the 20th century, we're going to talk a lot more about foreign policy, and America's role in World War I is important in understanding that because it's going to be different from world wars. We have another world war coming, and to kind of use or see the differences between how the United States handled entry into World War I and World War II, and then also like the effects afterwards. So the first thing that we're going to kind of briefly talk about, this isn't super important. This is kind of more review from world history, and that is the causes of war in Europe. So it's very important to remember that, the war in Europe started in 1914. The United States isn't going to enter until 1917. And so if you remember from world history, the main causes of World War I were militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So main. You might have even been taught about mania. So that involves kind of the assassination. In order to, higher order historical thinking, critical thinking skills, the best way to kind of break this up is that there are kind of like your long-term causes of the war. So militarism is, all these European countries and the United States, by the way, are building up their military. They're expanding, the number of troops that they have, their arsenal, and they're doing all of this out of competition with one another. So if you want to kind of, review from the American imperialism chapter, we talked about international Darwinism and that fear of like survival of the fittest and the fear of becoming a second-class power. In addition to all of that, you had a buildup of alliances in Europe. This is particular to Europe. The United States is still practicing that isolationist policy, that Washingtonian tradition. But in Europe, you have these networks of countries. It's a collective security. So the Triple Alliance is going to be Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And the Triple Entente is France, Russia, and Great Britain. These will kind of form into your central powers and your allied powers, because some other nations are kind of going to join in. Italy's going to kind of flip-flop a little bit. The next long-term cause is going to be American imperialism. So that competition for colonies and protectorates. The European powers had been doing that for a while, and it goes in line with militarism as well, this kind of heightened competition. And then the last long-term cause of the war is going to be nationalism. So because you had these huge empires like the Austro-Hungarian and the German Empire, the Russians even, there are certain nationalist groups or certain regions of these empires that spoke different languages. They didn't identify themselves as Austro-Hungarian, for example, like the Serbians. And so they believed in self-determination. They wanted to be independent. And so when you have that sense of nationalism and there's some unrest there, meanwhile, the empire is trying to hold tight onto that and to kind of suppress that. And so you have like an internal conflict within these empires, in addition to the growing tension among the European powers with one another. And it basically created a climate in Europe that was just ready for one thing to kind of set everything off. That immediate cause of World War I is going to be the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was assassinated by members of the Black Hand. The Black Hand were a Serbian nationalist group. So not the nation of Serbia, but instead think of them as like a terrorist organization. So there were ethnic Serbians living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They wanted to be, they wanted those boundaries to change so that they could be a part of the Serbian nation. And so think of them as a terrorist group that killed the future king of Austria-Hungary. Okay, that's going to set off the alliance system. The United States' original response to the war is neutrality. We don't have any formal alliances. That's a part of our isolationist policy that was the example was set under President Washington with his farewell address, and pretty much foreign policy wise, we kind of stayed out of other nations' political quarrels. Great Britain, though, is going to put up a naval blockade in the North Sea. And it's to prevent trade. So if you can think of why the Union used a blockade in order to prevent the South from gaining supplies. They actually seized some American ships that were trading with European powers. Wilson's going to protest that, and again, that's kind of early in the war. The most important thing in understanding with naval warfare and the United States trying to stay out of the conflict is going to have to do with Germany's use of submarine warfare, or U-boats, which was a new technology at this point in time, and it was pretty effective. In May of 1915, Germany is going to sink the Lusitania. The Lusitania is a British passenger ship. However, there are 128 Americans on board. This is the first major test to neutrality because Wilson needs to respond to that. And so they warned Germany that they cannot attack unarmed ships. Now, Germany is going to claim that, well, we don't know, what if there were American weapons being smuggled into Britain? Not smuggled, but you say it's a passenger ship, but what if there are weapons and arms and money that you're giving to Great Britain? We don't know that. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan was upset about that. He thought it was too much of a threat. Remember that he's a progressive, a populist. He is, an anti-imperialist. He is not in favor of war, so he's going to end up resigning. March of 1916, fast forward almost a year, the U-boats are going to attack the Sussex. Again, an unarmed merchant ship. It did injure some Americans, which then resulted in the Sussex Pledge, where Germany said, we promise not to do that again. We will give a warning shot in order to give the passengers enough time to get in the lifeboats before we sink the ship, so that it's going to save lives. They're still going after the ship because it could be carrying munitions or aid to the Allied powers. And so we were kind of all right, we'll settle with that. Now, technically, right, we're neutral, and this is really important because you're going to kind of see a continuation of this and how we handle World War II. Because remember, war in Europe is going to break out in the 1930s with Hitler, and the United States is going to try and stay out of it. And the United States isn't brought into it until we were attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. But you're going to see the same kind of example of the United States trying to stay neutral and kind of being drawn in. And a lot of that has to do with the economy. So though we are officially neutral, we were economically connected to Great Britain and France, so the Allied powers. Britain and France kind of demanded these supplies. Our American factories were able to produce them very efficiently. It created an economic boom after there was a recession at first. U.S. factories were sending supplies to Germany as well, but because the British were so effective in their blockade, more supplies went to the Allied powers than the Central powers. In addition to the actual producing of war materials and selling them to the Allied powers or to powers that were at war, the United States government allowed for people like J.P. Morgan to loan personal like money. So it's not US government loaning money to these countries, but JP Morgan as an individual and his corporation to loan money to those countries. So JP Morgan kind of helped finance the Allied powers war, their war front with about $3 billion. It just shows you how rich they were. It's kind of crazy. When you look at public opinion, Wilson again kind of favors the Allies. That's one of the reasons. And Bryan, Secretary of State, didn't like that. William James Bryan didn't like it. But so did the majority of Americans. Newspapers are going to portray Germany, and this kind of goes with yellow journalism, as cruel. They're a bully. They have Kaiser Wilhelm. They're portrayed as like brutes, and we'll talk about that in class a little bit. U.S. relations since the Revolutionary War period bolstered a lot of support for the French. Most native-born Americans supported the democratic governments of Britain and France. In 1914, when you look at first and second generation immigrants, they make up over 30% of the population, which means that we have a lot of diversity. So one of the reasons that we were like hesitant to get involved is, yes, even though the majority of Americans probably side with the British, you still had a huge chunk of the population, like 30% or more, that might have identified with the Central Powers. So if you look at the German immigrant population, the Irish hated Great Britain. We had a lot of Irish immigrants. And even kind of those more recent, like new immigrants, Italian Americans at first were, like supporting the Allies, and then they kind of shift. Poor Italians, they just get confused during World Wars. And then in addition to that, you had the fact that because the British blockade was so effective, so one, that's going to affect how we traded. We traded more with the Allies. But the other thing, it came with the press. So the only news that we got from Europe about the war was British. It was Ally power, bias, if you will. So the American press had a ton of sources talking about how the German soldiers were committing these war atrocities and war crimes in Belgium, which was a neutral nation. That was one of the justifications for why Britain got involved. And what the Germans were doing kind of in eastern France. Remember that this is trench warfare. It was a horrible war. And so the Americans were reading these sensationalized stories, and it might be true, but you guys know too, hopefully, that both sides in any given war are probably going to commit some type of like war crimes, especially if they have that power. That's just one of the things of war, is that there are bad things that happen to civilians. But the only news that was getting over was the sensationalized, like anti-German kind of news. Now, there's a small group, but very, very vocal, of Eastern Republicans that wanted to enter the war on behalf of the Allied powers. After the war, there are going to be connections to like, it's good for business. Like, war is good for business, right? It helps industry, it helps the banks because of loans, it helps kind of stimulate the economy. And so there's a small group of Eastern Republicans that did support, like, hey, let's just go join them. Like, right, it's kind of this expansionist policy. Maybe we can get some territory out of it. Small group, but pretty vocal. In addition to that, let's help the Allies, because if the Germans win, it'll affect the balance of power. It could affect foreign trade. They don't like that. So the idea was, like, if we help the Allied powers win, it'll be good long-term economically. The majority of Americans, though, were happy with the economy was doing well because we were funding the war, and we were, factories were, producing war items for the war, but also we liked the idea of peace at that point in time. Republicans such as Teddy Roosevelt were very vocal about the United States military power, like if there was war. And he was kind of encouraging, like, well, what if we do get drawn into war? We need to make sure that we're prepared. So remember, he was an expansionist. Think of his like military diplomacy, big stick diplomacy. Like, yes, we can talk of peace and we can try to stay out of it, but we need to be ready, kind of have that arsenal in the background. So that's his speak softly, carry a big stick view. Wilson and Congress, Congress kind of agreed with that. And so this preparedness view of is to increase defense spending. In 1915, Wilson was against it. He will eventually change his mind in support of that. So you have the National Defense Act, which is going to increase the Army. It is also going to approve the construction of warships in order to use have as our, as that big stick, just in case. But there's also a lot of opposition to war, especially from the Midwest and the West. They feared that because basically preparedness is like militarism, right? If we do that, is that going to be seen as a threat? And could that move actually draw us into war instead of it just being like precautionary? What if, the powers in Europe see that as the United States like getting ready to join the war, and so they attack us first? So anti-war activists were populists, progressives, socialists, the same kind of slew of characters that we've been talking about with William Jennings Bryan and Jane Addams. Jeannette Rankin was the first woman to be elected to Congress. She is going to end up voting against war. And she was predominantly trying to get support like for women's suffrage. Suffragettes at first were actively against the military buildup, participation. But once the war begins, you're going to see a huge shift. And we're going to do a lesson, if we have not already, in how we kind of shifted from neutrality to war and how the role that women played in that opinion. So the war's going on in Europe. Re-election for Wilson is coming up. He knows that the only reason he won in 1912 was because the Republicans split the ticket between those progressives and the conservatives. And so he knows that he needs to do something different in order to defeat the Republican Party. Charles Evan Hughes was a Supreme Court justice, former governor of New York, became the candidate for the Republican Party. The Democrats are going to use the war in Europe to kind of leverage Woodrow Wilson. And his campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." That peace sentiment, the fact that the economy was doing well, Charles Evan Hughes was kind of a weak candidate, and that it was a close election, but Wilson was able to win. What's ironic about all of this is that Wilson is going to be inaugurated in March of 1917, and then the war, our entry into the war, is just in a few short months. So why did we go to war in 1917? A couple things. Germany continues to use submarine warfare, and it's unrestricted. So they're attacking civilians. They're not sticking to that promise. In March, Germany sinks 5 unarmed merchant ships. So that's like tension has heightened because of that one thing. Then you have the Zimmerman telegram. And a lot of people think that this is the number, like a large reason why. It was a telegram, which you can see, like a Western Union coded telegram, was intercepted by British intelligence. It's from Germany to Mexico. And it proposed that Mexico join the alliance with the Central Powers with Germany. In return, Germany would help Mexico get back the land that they lost from the United States during the Mexican-American War back in the 1840s. Okay. It was leaked to the press and published in March, so right before the inauguration of 1917, and the people went crazy, like a ton of American nationalism. People were a lot of anti-German sentiment. That's going to shift. It doesn't mean that people were calling for war. Like they just so happened to like find this telegram. It's kind of interesting because the British, like if you know anything about World War I from world history, there was a huge stalemate in this trench warfare, and it was just devastating both sides. The sheer amount of death and the lack of progress, like it was a real problem on that, especially on that Western front. So the third thing, though, and this is what kind of got Wilson thinking about requesting a declaration of war, had to do with the Russian Revolution. So Wilson believed strongly in moral diplomacy. And he hadn't really, and there were some things that he had done with, like, the Jones Act and the Panama Canal, where he was trying to fix some of the problems of this pro-expansion, pro-imperialist policies of the Republican Party in the two presidencies before him, or administrations before him. And so his thought was, he was worried that the US was going to be drawn into war. But if we were going to get involved, he wanted to make sure it was for a good cause, right? And so his cause was democracy. So Russia, who had been ruled by an autocratic czar, was overthrown by Russian revolutionaries, and they proclaimed it a republic. Okay, so they were going to try originally to model it, after our government, like other governments, right? So they were going to be a republic, a representative government. And with that, so Wilson kind of saw it as an excuse for, we have to make the world safe for democracy. Now, by November, the Communist Party, it'll be formed into the Soviet Union. The Russians will kind of back out of the war. But Wilson's whole justification for doing this was to make the world safe for democracy. And he saw Germany and Austria-Hungary in particular as a threat to growing democracy around the world. So on April 2nd, 1917, right, so he's just been inaugurated, he asked Congress for a declaration of war. He cites Germany's submarine policy, and then also this idea of, making the world safe for democracy, to attack these empires and allow for the self-determination of nations. And that'll make sense more when he has his peace plan at the end of the war. April 6th, Congress votes and they approve for war. So the United States enters. We're not going to talk about the military part. Instead, we're going to focus mostly on the effects on the home front. So the Wilson administration creates hundreds of temporary wartime agencies, and he staffed them with experts from all across business and government and former politicians, in order to make these things run as efficiently as possible. Mobilization, and this is really important for World War II as well, we're going to do the same thing in World War II, is that we have to use the economy, the United States people, to support the war effort. Because not only are we supporting the American troops, but now we are pretty much supporting the British and the French, because they are drained. They are drained in morale, economically, militarily. And so the United States coming in as kind of that push, figure of speech, I guess, in order to kind of help. So they're going to use propaganda. They're going to take control of industries. And what's interesting about that is it is going to kind of play a role in showing how, what the government can do in order to accomplish a goal. So remember that most of the history that we've learned so far is people are very fearful of a large centralized government making actions like this. But during World War I, the American people were we're on board, tell us what to do and we'll do it. Which is interesting, because that kind of gave FDR the idea, and then Congress as well, kind of the go-ahead that the American people trust in the government enough to where if they create these big government policies and programs in order to help America, people jump on board. And they did that as well in the 1930s and to get out of the Great Depression. So New Deal programs of the Great Depression, okay? And so that would be context for that. So you could kind of refer back to the economic mobilization of World War I when we get to the Great Depression. So some of the important commissions or agencies that were created during World War I, one is going to be the War Industries Board. Now, Bernard Baruch was a Wall Street broker. They looked at priorities in regards to raw materials and prices. So a lot of prices were set, that people, private industries could not raise prices on anything. And then also how we're going to use raw materials. The Food Administration, Herbert Hoover, who is an engineer, he's going to be president of the United States, encouraged Americans to eat less meat and bread. so that it can instead be shipped over to feed the troops. That conservation, that we're not quite at rationing yet, but the conservation of it is going to see the food shipment triple in just the 2 years. So they would have things like, and the Committee on Public Information, which is on the next slide, played a large role in that, which is basically like, a marketing propaganda agency that created, and you'll see these in the coming slides, they created these posters and articles in newspapers and magazines that were all focused on encouraging Americans to do their part and help promote the war, because if they're not helping the soldiers at home, right, the home front is very important in supporting the troops over there fighting. And for many Americans, like very few people didn't know someone that didn't have a son or a father or a husband or a brother that was serving. The fuel administration is going to really focus on saving coal. Non-essential factories were going to be closed down. We had daylight savings time went into effect for the first time in order to maximize sunlight and energy. And it's still around, even though I don't know if it should be. The Railroad Administration took control over those private railroad companies, which is interesting, right? Because that's something that the populists argued for. But again, to promote the standardized railroad equipment, to become as efficient as possible and to use it the way in which the factories needed in order to get the things needed to Europe or to different parts of the country. The National War Labor Board is interesting because former President Taft, came in order to kind of mediate disputes between the workers and the employers. So after this big, like during the Progressive era, right, you had unions that were, demanding things. There were strikes that occurred. During a war, you cannot afford for a strike. They need those factories running, producing the supplies needed to support the war effort. And so because of that, like, it really helped labor during this time period, because before they would just say like, no, we have to draw a hard line, and just like, if they want to go on strike, they'll go on strike. But during World War I, they couldn't afford that. So wages are going to go up. 8-hour work days became more common between the companies, the factories, and the workers. Union membership is going to increase during that time. So the war was good for sure. And then here's the Committee on Public Information. George Creel was a journalist who was hired to kind of head it up. Think of it as propaganda and marketing. They are trying to encourage men to enlist. They had voluntary services for artists and writers, and so think of like, actors and performers, movie stars. Think of like Captain America. Like Captain America's World War II. But they were creating plays and, radio advertisements. The artists were drawing up posters and political cartoons, and all of it kind of depicted this idea of the boys as these heroes and how we need to support them. And the evil Germans and the Kaiser, and it played to different groups of people too, which what we talk about in class. Right, so the intended audience, they tried to target certain groups and encourage them to do their part and support the boys. A continuity in American history is during war, there is the limitation of civil liberties. Now, during the Civil War, for example, you had Abraham Lincoln, who suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And in World War I, you're going to see it again. So you have the Espionage Act, so people trying to incite rebellion, and the Sedition Act, which prohibited anyone from making any type of disloyal comments. 2,000 people were prosecuted under these laws. Half of them were convicted and jailed. Eugene Debs, socialist, former labor man turned socialist, was sentenced to 10 years for speaking out against the war. The view was, because it's like, okay, well, that's your First Amendment right. the view was, and how the Supreme Court saw it in the Schenck v. U.S. case, was that, and they upheld it. They said, yes, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act are okay because we need Americans to support the war effort. The right to free speech could be limited when it presented a clear and present danger to public safety. So if you're standing on the street corner passing out pamphlets going against the draft, the Selective Service Act, which is what was happening here, that has a negative effect on the home front and on war production and mobilization. And that one small act of talking bad against the government could cost us the war. They thought of it as like a slippery slope. It was a bold decision, but it was determined in 1919. It's also interesting because, First Amendment rights are going to be limited in other wars as well. If you think about Japanese internment, in the World War II, during the Vietnam War, they limited the press and like photographing coffins coming back from Vietnam. Even like the Patriot Act and the War on Terror, civil liberties can kind of be, there's that continuity of your civil liberties being limited during a time of war. That's really good continuity, or example of continuity. If you like in synthesis, like making connections, if you have an essay in regards to civil liberties during war. So the Selective Service Act is passed in 1917, and it creates the system of conscription. So during the Civil War, there was the Conscription Act, which just like established, like, here, we're going to, draft these people. The Civil Service Act was designed to be more democratic method. So what it did is it created local draft boards in order to make sure that all groups in the population would be called on an equal basis. So if you remember during the Civil War, it's like big government, and they just created one, and there was a lot of politics to it and a lot of corruption. If you were wealthy, you could pay a fee and someone would replace you. Those things were not going to happen with the Selective Service Act. So the first thing they did is all ages of men between 21 and 30 had to register for the draft. And that's still around today. Like, now it's been changed now from 18 to 45. But when young men in our country, when they turn 18, you have to register for the draft. That doesn't mean you're going to be drafted. It just means that you're in the system, okay? And then there are lotteries that the local draft boards complete in order to select the people. And we'll talk more about that in Vietnam, okay? That was the last time that we had a draft. So 2.8 million men were called in the lottery, and an additional 2 million men volunteered during World War I. Half of those men are going to serve in the Western Front. 400,000 African Americans serve in World War I. They serve in segregated units. Some were allowed to be officers, and they were banned from the Marine Corps because the Marines were considered a superior group. And remember that the justification for why African Americans, if you think about the history of African Americans serving in war, when we look at the Civil War and we looked at like the 54th Massachusetts, they were used as manual labor. They were seen as inferior. Now, the 54th kind of showed that African Americans could fight just as well, if not better, than white regiments and white units. And so, yes, they were allowed to fight. However, they weren't allowed in those superior elite combat groups like the Marine Corps. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, who we talked about with the progressive reformers, remember, he was had the more radical opinion compared to Booker T. And he was talking about social and political equality. Like, he demanded it. And it kind of frightened a lot of white Americans. It's like it was too aggressive and too radical of a view. However, Du Bois believed that, yes, like, Black men need to sign up and fight, because if we're making a world safe for democracy abroad, then when we come back in our uniforms and, after we've won the war, surely that will show white supremacists and white Americans that we have to have democracy at home as well. And he believed that. He believed that strongly, that if African American, and he encouraged them to sign up and to volunteer, and they did. Because if we're fighting for democracy overseas, surely we will be guaranteed that at home. And unfortunately, he was mistaken. There were African American soldiers who came back after World War I who were lynched in their uniforms because there was a lot of, in the 1920 was like the height of the KKK around the country. And we'll talk more about that in the next unit. But a lot of white supremacists, when they saw African Americans in their uniforms walking through the streets, they saw that as a check on their power. And so they had to show them as an example to the other African Americans in the communities that they weren't, that those men weren't equal. And so there was an increase in lynchings of African Americans after World War I. And it'll, again, because there was a height in the KKK, and that's going to be connected to a lot of different things, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter. After 19 months of fighting, there were 49,000 combat deaths. Total deaths, though, due to disease and the influenza pandemic. So with trench warfare, there was a lot of infection and diseases spread that way. However, the influenza pandemic, over 500,000 at home, 20 to 40 million worldwide. It was by far the way more deadly than the war itself, or even multiple wars. The pandemic was spread during the war, was transmitted through soldiers, and you guys you're going to have an assignment on the pandemic. So yeah. So all groups in American society, business and labor, women, men, immigrants, native-born, they had to adjust to a wartime economy. Women are going to play an important role in vacating the positions in factories. So they're going to work, many are going to work for the first time. They're going to be volunteers. They're also going to earn wages. And even though you had that suffragette movement during the Progressive Era, and we talked about how we ended the Progressive Era in 1917 when we entered World War I, that is true. So your Progressive Era amendments start with the 16th Amendment with income tax. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators, so to looking at like economic reform, more democratic process of government, like political corruption. The 18th Amendment is prohibition. Now, yes, the temperance movement was a part of the reform movement and like kind of like more religious thing, but the main reason that the 18th Amendment was passed and ratified during World War I had more to do with the conservation of wheat. So they're telling Americans to, don't eat as much bread so that we can send the wheat over and like feed the troops. And so it's kind of contradictory when you're using those grains though to, to brew beer and alcohol. And so that was one of the reasons that the 18th Amendment was passed, even though, yes, you had the temperance movement leading up to it. World War I kind of played more of a immediate role as to why they passed the 18th Amendment. And then you have the 19th Amendment, which was passed after World War I because of the role that women played during the war and stepping up, which they'd done in other American wars as well. That's a continuity. But the combination of the progressives and the suffragettes, what the women did during the war to keep during mobilization in order to kind of help the boys, they could no longer be denied their right to vote at the federal level. And so the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. For Mexican and African Americans, there's a shift in migration shift. And we'll talk more about this in the 1920s as well. Job opportunities, there's the Mexican Revolution. It caused thousands of Mexicans to cross the border to work in the United States as migrant workers in agriculture and mining. Some make their way to Midwest factories. A really important shift in African American history is going to be the Great Migration. So before World War I, African Americans were predominantly had stayed in the South on the land that they were once enslaved in. So even we're a couple generations removed from slavery at this point, but they were kind of stuck. We talked about cyclical poverty and indebtedness because of sharecropping system, Jim Crow, poll taxes, and literacy tests. It took away their power after 1877, so they had very little political power. And they just didn't have the resources to make their way out of the discrimination that existed in the South, especially economically. However, during World War I, when all the majority of white men are leaving or being deployed overseas, there were vacancies in the northern factories. And so what you had was factory owners took the trains down south with their tickets and gave men, say, hey, like, we need you to come work in Chicago or St. Louis or Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., New York, Baltimore. And what you had was this mass exodus of African Americans that they had the opportunity to escape Jim Crow segregation and intimidation and violence. And so there was a major shift, and then you're going to see those kind of urban areas becoming more diverse. It is going to create some hostility, and we'll kind of talk about that in the coming slides. So January 1917, Wilson is going to talk about peace without victory. His goal, because they knew that they were going to defeat the Central Powers, but his goal was now kind of spreading that moral diplomacy. And so he wrote something called his 14 points. It was his plan for world peace. He wanted to make this war the war to end all wars, which is super ironic, but that was his goal. The first 5 of his 14 points focused on creating an environment that would prevent something like this from happening again. Because remember, like, even if you look at the things that led up to the war, like, those are things that could have been easily prevented. So no secret treaties, freedom of the seas. They wanted to lower tariffs, and that's in line with the Democratic policy. Because if you're trading with these countries, you're less likely to go to war with them. We need to reduce arms, so attacking that militarism, and kinder colonial practices. That one is kind of funny because the United States now has like protectorates and territories that we acquired. And so it was pretty radical. And obviously it's going to have some opposition from the Republican Party, but also members of the Democratic Party as well. 6 through 13 were, this is how we need to change the map of Europe and practicing self-determination. That will help as well prevent future conflict. His 14th point, the most important one probably for this course, is going to be the creation of the League of Nations. Okay, the League of Nations and his idea were to create a group, basically think of the United Nations, to create this group of world powers where when there's a conflict, they all come together and they talk it out. So it's a diplomatic league, right, in order to prevent the escalation that occurred with World War I. And so the Treaty of Versailles is going to be negotiated between the big 4. So you have Great Britain, Italy, France, and then the United States. This is the first time that a president is going to travel abroad for a diplomatic conference, because Wilson wanted to deliver his 14 points in person. And what's Wilson's biggest issue, though, is going to be not like gaining the support of like the Central Powers and those countries. It actually had more to do with the other remaining 3. Great Britain and France saw this war like there was a fault. It was Germany's fault. They were aggressive, and they started it. And they wanted to punish Germany. Okay. Where Wilson's approach was more like, hey, listen, like, we don't need a winner in this. Like, there was a mistake was made. Let's move on. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again. And so Wilson really struggled with trying to get them on his side. And so what ends up happening is Germany is punished for the war. They're disarmed, so they're not allowed to like have a standing military. They're stripped of all of their colonies. They're forced to admit guilt, which that's not something that's normally like included in one. And they had to pay $33 billion in war reparations. This is going to create a very defeated, obviously. I mean, Germany was defeated anyways, but a lot of anger and resentment among the German people, because if you think about it, it was the German leaders that kind of had kind of orchestrated all of this. And when you look at the effects that the peace terms are going to have on the people of Germany and the poverty and the superinflation, economic depression, it's going to create a vacuum of hostility and resentment towards the Allied powers, which is why that the treaty is probably considered one of the causes of what happened in Germany, the rise of Hitler, which is going to lead to World War II. So while Wilson was trying to orchestrate a peace treaty that was a war to end all wars, in reality, what came out was a war that was going to lead to another war. They are going to apply the principle of self-determination to territories. So if you look at this map of Europe, and we're not even talking about the Middle East, we'll talk about the effects of World War I on the map in the Middle East. So like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of like those borders are also going to play a role because of this. And Western powers are going to draw those maps. And that's going to lead to a lot of long-term conflict because you have rival tribes and different ethnic groups, the Sunnis and the Shias. None of those things were considered when they drew the political maps of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. But we'll get to that when we start talking about more Middle East relations with the United States. And they created the League of Nations. This was Article 10 in the peace treaty. And it basically said that each member nation must stand ready to protect the independence and territorial integrity of other nations. And it's going to present a problem for Wilson. So in order for the United States to approve the treaty, it's not Wilson's job. That is a power given to the United States Senate. And it needs 2/3 approval on all parts, okay? But the League of Nations, like Wilson's baby, the thing that he wants more than anything, like he sacrificed a lot with the treaty, with the Big Four, so that he could get that League of Nations. He believed that that was going to be the thing that created peace in the future. And Republican senators had a lot of objections, in particular to Article 10. They said they wanted to be sovereign. Article 10 took away sovereignty. And so think of it like this. If the United States is a part of the League of Nations, and let's say, something happens with France and Italy. If the League of Nations votes to support France in war with Italy, the United States would then be committed to aiding that. And the Republicans, the kind of like this more, I guess, like conservative group, said that they didn't like that. They didn't want to be drawn into a conflict that they had nothing to do with. Wilson's going to argue that, well, no, there won't end up being a war because of this collective security of the League of Nations. It's very idealistic, and it was unprecedented. It wasn't something that Henry Cabot Lodge and other Republicans were willing to give up. Wilson also made it very difficult for himself because in the 1918 midterm elections, he started asking voters to support Democrats as an act of patriotic duty. It was extremely partisan. I know that doesn't sound like that big of a deal today because we are so partisan, but he made it super political because, again, it was his baby. He was very passionate about it. Republicans are going to win majority, though, in the House and in the Senate. So Wilson now needs Republican support in order to get the treaty signed and to create the League of Nations. But Henry Cabot Lodge is going to play a big role in that. So there are a couple different groups. There are the irreconcilables who could not accept U.S. membership into the League of Nations. So they were the ones who are like, no, we want nothing to do with the League of Nations. Then there are the reservationists, a much larger group. Lodge is a part of it, said that they would accept the League, but they want it to be revised a little bit. So Wilson had the opportunity to compromise with those reservationists and change a couple things. However, he refused to do so. Instead, he went across the country on this big speaking tour, really trying to sell the League of Nations to the people, which is interesting because it kind of reminds me of Andrew Jackson and the Bank of the United States, right? He tried to, even though some stuff was going on politically, like in Washington, D.C., he was like, well, I'm going to take it to the people and I'm going to tell them why the bank is bad. Woodrow Wilson went across the country. Now, they have like the radio and that technology to kind of help, but he was trying to convince the people to convince their representatives, their senators, to vote in favor of it. However, he suffers a stroke in Colorado and was never really able to fully recover. So the Senate's going to defeat the treaty. We never signed the Treaty of Versailles. We never joined the League of Nations. Wilson is actually, it's interesting. We don't know how severe his stroke was and how much he was able to do in that last year and a half of his presidency. There are a lot of rumors that his wife actually, like, there were certain like cabinet members that like rarely ever saw him, and that, you know, she would be the liaison between Wilson and his cabinet members and the decisions that were made in that last year that he was president. And so it's kind of interesting to see, like, well, was she the one making a decision? Was he lucid? We don't really know. So again, yeah, we do not join the League of Nations. We do not sign the Treaty of Versailles. So what that means is we had to sign a separate peace deal with Germany in order to kind of officially end the war. So post-war problems, 4 million men who had served, over 4 million men, return home to civilian life. So the jobs that women and African Americans were doing, they kind of wanted those jobs back. There is going to be a brief recession. That's something that's kind of expected after a war. It's something that's always existed because you have that shift in the factory production from wartime materials and that high demand of that to like going back to like consumer goods. So brief recession, European farm products were back on the market. Farm prices fell. It's going to hurt U.S. farmers. There's going to be a purchasing spree during the war, which I already talked about. Inflation a little bit. Again, that recession's going to happen, but it's going to kind of bounce back to for the roaring 20s. Okay. But there was a brief recession, but that's to be expected. Post-war problems. A lot of anti-German hysteria is going to happen during the war. Your book doesn't do a very good job at talking about that, but German Americans were required to be, I guess, like documented as like enemy aliens. There were a lot of towns and cities and states that, they didn't teach, you're not allowed to speak German. You weren't, I read this one thing that's quite gruesome to where they like slaughtered like dachshunds or German breeds of dogs. In school, you weren't allowed to sing or to play music by German composers. Like there was this big push. Instead of, dachshunds were called, or like beer, like they attacked like German beers and things like, it was just, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment. That is going to shift into anti-communist hysteria, known as the Red Scare. And it's going to play a role in the 1920s as well. But it did start because of World War I. So you had this intense sense of xenophobia. And Attorney General Mitchell Palmer established a special office under J. Edgar Hoover, which he's going to end up heading the FBI in future years. to gather information on radicals. There were the Palmer raids, where these mass arrests of anarchists, socialists, people that were affecting like the labor movement. Between November of 1919 and January of 1920, so just a few months, over 6,000 people are going to be arrested. And there wasn't really any criminal evidence. It was just kind of like word of mouth. The best example of this, like especially for if you need a specific piece of like factual information that would support this, is Sacco and Vanzetti. So Sacco and Vanzetti were these Italian immigrants. They were known anarchists in their community in that city, and they were charged with shooting and killing 2 men during a robbery. Now, there was no physical evidence at all whatsoever. The only evidence that connected them to this crime is an eyewitness said the robbers looked Italian. So what happened is local authorities said, well, I know 2 Italian guys that I would love to lock up, Sacco and Vanzetti. So even though there were no like actual physical evidence that connected them to the crime, they were arrested, found guilty, and were executed. And that just shows the level of xenophobia and fear at that point in time that the American people were like, and there were some people that were obviously opposed to it, but for that to happen in our justice system just showed you the level of fear mongering that was taking place. Eventually, Palmer's credibility is going to be questioned, really looking at civil liberties. And so it's going to end pretty quickly. It's also interesting because we're going to have a second Red Scare after World War II. That's going to be a little bit longer lasting. This one was really brief, but there is that comparison. Okay, so the nation at this point in time is in support of this idea of a free market capitalist economy. Rugged individualism is this idea that like when times get tough, like you just work harder and it'll pay off. And so because of that, and because of the connections, if you think back to the labor movement with the connections with like socialism and even like some anarchists that were thrown in there that kind of were lumped together in this group, there's going to be an increase in distrust in the union movement. So even though unions were really successful during the war, after the war, you're going to have this kind of conservative shift back to where like, ooh, well, maybe they're a communist. And we saw that during the labor movement of the Gilded Age. So it softens a little bit during the Progressive and World War I with the Square Deal and Clayton Antitrust Act. But there are going to be a series of strikes that are going to happen in 1919 that are going to turn public opinion against the unions again. In addition to that, there are going to be some race riots that occur. In particular, the worst one was in Chicago. And we'll talk more about it in class, where 40 people were killed, over 500 were injured. There was a lot of tension that had grown as African Americans were moving into these cities. A lot of like similar things that they saw with like immigrant groups coming in. They were segregated by neighborhoods, which allowed for that discrimination to increase. And then also like the competition for jobs is going to play a role in all of that. And so lynchings are going to increase during this time. So there's racial violence in the South, but it's also going to happen in those northern cities as well. Okay. So that is World War I, its effects. And it really is, it's going to continue. A lot of these effects that we just talked about, we're going to get more specific during the Roaring 20s, which is our next topic to talk about. And I hope that you learned something today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.